radical economic transformation, a topic that all of you are so familiar with. So I'm not really going to bore you a lot about radical economic transformation, save just to make a few remarks. In, I think, exactly a week's time, our country will be celebrating for the 62nd time the adoption of the Freedom Charter. As you know, this is the iconic document that in many ways defined the future trajectory of our country. Our forebears drafted this document in 1955. And what were they concerned about? They were concerned about where the country was going to, and they all gathered together in Kliptown and felt that they needed to articulate their aspirations, their wishes for their country. And that is a good starting point for a discussion on radical economic transformation, because in many ways it perfectly captures, to some extent, not only the current debate about this very important topic, but also clearly sets out what our forebears had in mind, because as they met then, they asked themselves a number of questions. What type of a country do they want to live in? And the aspirations of the drafters of the Charter essentially focused and really revolved on, in my view, two critical issues: how to bring about democracy in South Africa, and how to ensure that everyone has rights, human rights, and also how, having installed democracy, to ensure that people do share in the wealth of the country. And they, in looking at this, had a deep-seated problem, which they articulated and said, our people were robbed of their birthright to land, to liberty, to peace, by a form of government, they said, that was founded on injustice and inequality. And they also stated that our country will never be prosperous or free until all our people live in brotherhood, enjoying equal rights, and underlying as well as opportunities. That is what they said as early as 1955. One of the central problems they thus recognized was that apart from the majority of our people not having been robbed of their birthright to land, and as a result of that, they concluded that South Africa's prosperity as a country, and indeed you could add as an economy, will never happen unless all these matters are addressed. They then went ahead and expressed a very deep wish, and their deep wish was saying the national wealth of our country, which they described as the heritage of South Africans, must be restored to the people. This, they said, because clearly the wealth of the country had been appropriated by a minority and was not available to be enjoyed by all South Africans. It is perhaps important to pause and acknowledge that just as much as the call for democracy and the end to injustice came about as a result of the exclusion of the majority of the people of South Africa from participating in the governance of their country in terms of the choice of who should govern them, through making the choice through free and fair elections. Equally, the call for economic transformation has come about as a result of the exclusion of the majority of South Africans from participating and enjoying the wealth of the country. Now, apartheid colonialism, as we call it, really wreaked havoc on many South Africans. And not only through the denial of democracy, but also through dispossession of the majority of South Africans. Now, given the extent of the dispossession that happened and the discrimination and the exploitation that ensued, the call for the people to share in the wealth of the country, as set out in the Freedom Charter, was essentially a call to have a radical form of economic transformation. Now, the dispossession that we had in our country, and that's where we should start, to have a deep understanding of what dispossession did to the people of our country, with a view of getting to grips of what we should do moving forward. Now, what did dispossession do? It introduced inequality in a country where there was basic equality amongst the people who lived here, to a large extent. Introduced inequality, but it also brought about grinding poverty. Grinding poverty in the sense that having been dispossessed of your land, your assets, asset poverty became the order of the day. Houses that people lived in were destroyed, livestock was killed or taken away, and what was also destroyed was what many of us never really get to think about. It was the generational asset transmission that takes place in every household. Every family has a generational asset transmission. When your father or mother or parents pass on a generational basis, they pass on some assets that people use to eke a livelihood and to get on economically. Now, that was destroyed because there was dispossession. Skills transfer was curtailed. The people who used to work the land, having been removed from their land, suddenly found themselves in a diaspora, and they therefore lost the capability and the knowledge to work the land. And one of the results of that today is, as much as people are given land that had been taken away from them over many years, when they return to the land, they don't have the skills. Because those skills were destroyed, they no longer have them. And government, therefore, has to do some extra work to make sure that they can work the land. Unemployment also set in. A migratory labor system set in because as people were dispossessed, they then had to find ways of eking out a living. So they then had to move to the urban areas, as we all know. Cultural practices were destroyed, and a racial spatial development of our country then set in. Now, these are all the things that then happened, and that gave rise to the call that was made in 1955 about economic transformation. Now, over the intervening 6 decades, the principles of redress, of redistribution, social justice, and equality have been at the center, at the real core of ANC economic policy. The ANC, in fact, as early as the 40s, when they adopted the African claims, if you go through the African claims, embedded in the African claims is the call for economic justice, where black people were crying out for places to trade, were crying out for opportunities to be open for them, and those opportunities were absent. And these principles have underpinned the ANC's policies in government as well, notably the RDP, which we all know, as well as the National Development Plan. Now, at the ANC's Mangaung conference, where I was elected as deputy president in 2012, the organization embraced and adopted the National Development Plan as the overarching framework for the second phase of the democratic transition, and the pursuit thereof had to be socio-economic transformation. The first phase having been installing democracy and justice in our country, the second phase, therefore, had to face up to the economic deprivation of the majority of South Africans. And people often criticize the drafters of the Constitution, and they say, you should have focused more on the economy and less maybe on democracy. Well, it may well be so. But the balance of forces was such that the real focus was focusing on democracy. I recall, and I digress for a minute, when we were negotiating the Constitution. That was the time when Minister Welgemoed, who was the Minister of Telecommunications, was seeking to introduce mobile telephony in our country. And all of a sudden, you had all these major telephone companies in the world, SBC in the United States, Cable and Wireless from the UK, hobnobbing with a number of people in our country to try and introduce mobile telephony. And one person in the ANC got wind of this happening, and this is happening in 1992, 1993. And he came rushing and said, they want to introduce mobile telephony. The ANC must stop this. If not stop it, must redirect it in a different direction. So they came to me at the World Trade Center and started chatting to all of them. Joe Slovo was the first to say, SG, our Secretary General then, he says, SG, stop this nonsense about mobile telephony. We must grasp power. Once we have political power, the rest shall follow. So stop this nonsense. So the focus then was on political democracy and getting basic human rights for our people. And that was the beachhead for us. And admittedly, the economic clauses in the Constitution that we drafted were supposed to be the foundation for rebuilding our country and positioning it on an economic platform that would yield benefits for all of us as South Africans. But in the end, it was at Mangaung when we realized that we needed to give more focused attention to the economy. And that is when the second transition then commenced. And the focus now has been on economic freedom. The Mangaung Conference therefore recognized that in the nearly 2 decades since the advent of democracy, political freedom had largely been achieved. The priority now was to pursue economic freedom, and those who are interested in knowing where the term radical economic transformation really comes from. This term was first used in government, admittedly by the governing party, the ANC, when we were focusing on the medium-term strategic framework, which was spawned by the National Development Plan. And the question we asked ourselves is, what else can we do as a country and as a government to speed up the economic transformation of our country? And this is what we adopted in 2014. The MTSF of 2014 to 2019, which is the current term of the government, introduced the term to signal the intensification and acceleration of the economic transformation process. What we were seeking to do is to say, we now need to up the pace of economic transformation in our country. It is not a break from existing policy. It is the intensification of current policy, but with a clear focus focusing on certain things and areas that we need to do, and it does not represent a new and, more importantly, uncertain path. Radical economic transformation, therefore, indicates a new phase of accelerated implementation of the long-standing economic policies of the ANC, obviously focusing on what is doable, on areas that we can focus more attention on. Part of the problem, though, with the current discourse and conversation on a radical economic transformation is that the term has often been misused and in some circles misrepresented, but a number of other people have also misunderstood it. We now know that some highly paid PR specialists contrived a plan to use terms such as radical economic transformation and white monopoly capital, essentially to launch a publicity offensive in defense of their clients. And we know who those clients are. And it was part of defining a new narrative where those who stood in the way of their clients' interests were presented as being opposed to radical economic transformation and representing the interests of what one would call white monopoly capital. It has therefore become accepted in many quarters that the term radical economic transformation is often deployed to either mask or justify activities that would be best described as state capture. Some people use RET, radical economic transformation, to proclaim measures that are intended to cement their radical credentials rather than actually achieve meaningful improvement in the lives of our people. However, if we are to progress as a democratic nation, we need to ensure that we should not be distracted or even sidetracked by the misuse of the term. What we need to do is to go beyond slogans, is to go to the heart of the matter and look at what needs to be done to redress the imbalances of the past, where my remarks started from. The dispossession that the majority of South Africans and black people had in this country spawned unemployment, poverty, and inequality, and the exclusion of black people from playing a key role in the economy of their country. That is what we need to address. We must therefore focus on the real substance of radical economic transformation and the steps that we need to take. And may I add, the steps that need to be taken should be steps that all of us as South Africans take. All of us should be active and enthusiastic participants in ensuring that radical economic transformation does indeed happen. Just as much as we were all, to a man and a woman, participants, some were maybe not so actively involved or not so enthusiastic, but all of us were participants in making sure that we do have democracy installed in our country. So this challenge that faces us now is a challenge that requires all of us to participate. And radical economic transformation is in essence about building a more equal society through sustained and inclusive growth. It requires that we essentially change the structure of our economy. Why should we change the structure of our economy? Our economy was structured on a lopsided basis or in a lopsided way. Lopsided in that it was structured to benefit a minority in our country, and this country and the whole world is going in the direction of inclusivity. There is now these days no place you can go to and not find talk about being inclusive. You go to the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab will be talking about how we can come up with strategies, plans, actions, initiatives that will include as many people as possible. And I give a good classical example that if you are going to set up a mine anywhere in the country, you should now not only be thinking about yourself as executives, your shareholders, you should also be thinking about those in the community who live there. So that if you are going to install infrastructure, bring a pipe of water, it should not just bypass the community that lives nearby. It should be inclusive and say, how do we make sure that everyone benefits from whatever activity that we can be involved in? So we need to fundamentally alter the racial and, importantly, also the gender composition of the ownership, the control and management of our economy. Some people who have come outside from our country have looked at our economy and our country have said, one of the problems with South Africa is that the growth of your economy is being held back because it's not firing on all cylinders. It's not utilizing all the resources that this country is richly endowed with. You need to unlock all those resources, unlock the capabilities of your people, but also, more importantly, the participation of your people to get involved in running, benefiting from your economy. And if we do that, then you find that you unlock the full engines of your country. I was looking at the rugby match just over the weekend, and I see some progress happening. In the past, we used to see the rugby team representing South Africa as an all-white team. These days, we're beginning to see, and this has happened because of the calls that have been made over and over that transform. Rugby South Africa transform. Transform so that you include as many of your own citizens as possible. And there I was, looking at all these young men scoring tries, black, white, colored, all of them involved in this endeavor of making our country great. And I said, this is the South Africa I want to be part of and I want to live in. Because what are we doing? Just using rugby as a good example. We're utilizing all the manpower. Rugby has to be manpower because that's what it is. We're using all the people that we've got in our country. And similarly, when it comes to transforming our economy, we should do precisely that. We cannot have an economy that continues to be dominated just by white people. Similarly, we cannot have an economy that continues to be dominated and benefits just men. This necessarily requires that we address things such as the concentration of ownership in our economy, concentration of management control in our economy. What this calls for is that we must come up with strategies, initiatives, and ideas, put them to the fore, put them on the table, and say this is how we would like to do it. Many significant economic sectors are still dominated also by a few companies in our country. Unlocking that, and this is what someone from the IMF said, concentration in your economy in terms of ownership and companies that exist means that you are too concentrated, the talent pool, the innovation that should be there is too little. Unlock it, and by unlocking it, you are then able to gain much more benefit. Not only does this concentration make transformation more difficult, it also prevents entrants from coming in, and therefore we need to look at all those measures. Now here, one is throwing around some of the things that we can do. We should also look at what other measures can we use? What other measures can we use the procurement system that is in government is something that can be used without wasting resources, without the overpricing that often takes place, and without having certain sections of government captured where influence is just revolves around certain individuals, certain families, and certain companies. We need to broaden. And our people out there are crying out for a broadened type of involvement and engagement in the economy. We also, as we diversify our economy, to diversify it in a number of areas at the productive level. And the government is looking at how do you then find a way of cranking up the industrialization of our country. And as we do that, we also want to speed ahead with a program that we've now started of developing black industrialists. We focus on developing 100. A number of people also in the ANC have said, but why just 100? Why not more? And that is what we're focusing on. And through this, we're finding really good partners. The private sector is coming forward through funding and skills provision. We're finding that more and more of the private sector are responding to the initiative that government has come up with of focusing on industrialists. Now, we've got a number of sectors where we need to speed up this type of activity. It could be in agriculture, it could be mining. In reality, we need to do a whole number of things. Sometimes we will make mistakes, and sometimes we will really have great success. We also need to speed up the skills acquisition process. The young people of our country are crying out for skilling, and we need to provide skills. And we need to do so on a massive basis. And I'm one for massification of the various efforts that we can take, be it promoting black businesses, 100% black businesses, be it making sure that young people have as many skills as possible. This is what we need to do. And one of the things that we also need to do, and which we are now the process of doing on a massive basis, is to bring in up to 1 million young people. 1 million young people into the world of work through learnerships, through internships, and over a 3-year period, we're going to have 1 million of these young people being brought into the world of work. Colin Coleman and Stephen Kosef and others are helping us to get to that point through the YES project that many of you will be au fait with. And this talks to massifying efforts. And in many ways, as we address the issue of disempowerment, unemployment, poverty, we must almost do it like we're saving somebody from a fire. If there is a fire, you go in with great haste, with great speed, with great precision, and go and save them. This is what this country needs. We need to be serious, we need to be focused, and where there are problems, we should go out and address those problems, because our task should be to transform the economy of our country, to create jobs, and to make this country a winning country. And those who have been privileged enough to get an education, to get business acumen, should also be on hand to go and help those who were de-skilled over the many years of oppression and exploitation. They must be willing to come in to the fore and say, this is the role that we can play. And more importantly, as I conclude, radical economic transformation can really be achieved if all South Africans work together, business, government, trade unions, and communities work together to make sure that we do indeed transform the economy of our country. From the ANC point of view, this is now the big game in town. radical economic transformation of an effective nature that is going to truly transform the future trajectory of our country. What will be the benefit? The benefit is to enhance more stability in our country, create more jobs, skill our young people, and it will result in an economy that will function effectively. We will deepen the governance in our country. We will also strengthen the various institutions that we have. It is when we can do all these things that South Africans will be able to stand proud and say, our country is truly a winning country. And if we can approach this in the same way that we approach the dawn of democracy, when all of us were really, truly excited and really opened our hearts and minds, if we can open our hearts and minds to radical economic transformation, then the rest becomes a lot easier, because we are then able to find solutions. Where there are difficulties, we do what Madiba says. It may all look very difficult until it is done. And if we can do that, we'll find that it was just as easy. And maybe, yes, trying as we found democracy. And through this, we will also be able to build a nation, and a winning nation at that. Thank you very much.